Speaking in public is without a doubt one of the most valuable skills you can have in any profession. But according to at least one survey, it's also in people's top 3 fears. And even if you're not scared of speaking in public, there's a really good chance no one's actually ever taught you how to be better at speaking in front of crowds. What's up, everyone? My name is Adam. I'm a former lawyer, business exec, and college prof. And in this video, I want to share with you everything that I've learned about speaking in front of crowds and how to be better at it over the past couple of decades. Before we get started, you should know something about me, and that's that I'm a closet introvert. I actually met my wife at work, and she likes to joke that I had her fooled for the first several years because I had to be outgoing for my job, and so that meant that I seemed confident when I was speaking in public, when in fact, I am actually a dyed-in-the-wool introvert and would much rather be alone in a room and not speaking in front of large crowds. But if I figured out how to get comfortable doing it, then I'm confident that you can too, if you apply some of these tips. The first thing you need to know about public speaking is that if you want to get better at it, you probably need to forget everything you learned about public speaking in school, because it is not at all representative of what you're going to see in the real world. If your schooling was anything like mine, you probably had to do a bunch of presentations that were anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes in length, and you were encouraged to memorize things. And the students who did well on these things generally tended to be those who were more naturally gifted at speaking in public in the first place, which means that school didn't actually teach you anything about public speaking. It just, rewarded those people who were already good at talking. So not super helpful. So forget everything you learned in school and let's focus on some of the things you can do better now. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to make sure you don't memorize your speech. Already, this is a complete departure from everything that you probably already learned in school about speaking publicly, because there you are encouraged to memorize your speech. But there's a few reasons why you don't want to do this. First of all, when you memorize your speech, you memorize it in a specific order. And if you're forced to come out of that order, then everything kind of flies out of the window. So in a real world scenario, rarely are you going to be called to give a speech where you're going to get to stand up and recite what you have memorized uninterrupted for any length of time. When I was early in my career, I had a product manager role where I had to spend a lot of time presenting to colleagues and to leadership within the organization that I was part of, sometimes to clients. And what I realized in that role was that if you tried to memorize your speech, you were never going to get anywhere, because as you talked, if people had questions, they would interrupt you. They would ask you about things that you were going to get to later on in the presentation. They would kind of throw you curveballs about things that you weren't expecting. And so the only way to actually speak confidently in front of a room full of people is to know the material and to be able to speak naturally and from the gut. If you try and memorize things, the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to get nervous and you're going to freeze up, because people are going to be expecting you to deviate from that script that you have so closely memorized. The other reason you don't want to rely on memorization for giving speeches is that once you get into the professional world, you will often be called on to give presentations that can go anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes, and you might have to do multiple of these a week. Now, if you are in school, you have to give a few presentations a semester. They're 5 minutes long. You can get away with memorizing them, even if it takes you 10 hours to memorize a speech, because you have enough time to do it. If you are memorizing 60-minute speeches word for word and you have multiple of them to do in a single week, you just don't have time. It can't physically be done. The other issue is that a lot of times those 30 to 60-minute long presentations that you have to give, because of the real world realities of presenting in the business world, sometimes you have to give those same spiels in 5 minutes. If I had a dime for every single time this happened to me, I probably could have retired 10 years earlier. So you have to know your material well enough that you can take what you thought was going to be a 60-minute long presentation and condense it down into 5 minutes, still get your point across, and when necessary, still convince your audience to do what you're asking them to do. That is completely impossible to do if the only way that you've prepared is to memorize verbatim what you're going to say. Related to the previous point, the next tip I have for you is that when you're delivering any kind of public address, you want to speak as naturally as possible. To give you an idea of why this is important, I'm going to play for you 3 versions of the same line. One of them is going to be read, the other one is going to be memorized, and the other one is going to be just spoken naturally based on what someone thinks should have been said in that scenario. And you can see for yourself which of those 3 is more engaging, which of those 3 you would rather listen to. How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler. The Activity and Art of Reading. This is a book for readers and for those who wish to become readers. Particularly, it is for readers of books. Even more particularly, it is for those whose main purpose in reading books is to gain increased understanding. How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler, The Activity and Art of Reading. This is a book for readers and for those who wish to become readers, specifically for readers of books, more particularly for those who wish to gain a greater understanding from books. How to Read and Why by Mortimer J. Adler. This is a book about reading, and specifically it's a book for learning how to get the most out of what you read for those who call themselves readers, as well as for those who want to become better readers. Now, the only way that you're going to be able to speak naturally about a topic without memorizing it is if you actually know your material inside and out. This became really, really clear to me relatively early in my career. I had been working for an organization where I was reporting directly to the chief marketing officer, and I had been working on a presentation for him to deliver at a conference where he was going to be delivering this sort of keynote address. If you think it's weird that someone else is preparing the presentation for a keynote speaker, then you probably don't fully understand how the business world works. So I was doing all the work of preparing my boss's presentation for him. The keynote speech was going to happen on a Monday. I got this ready for him. It was a Thursday or a Friday. And then I went away for the weekend with some friends. We went to New York City and we were having a good time. And on Sunday evening, I got a phone call from my boss and he said, something's come up. I can't make it to the conference on Monday. I need you to fly to Toronto and I need you to give the keynote in my place. This is Sunday night. This is a keynote speech in front of 500 business owners that I have to deliver the very next day. I obviously wasn't even in my hometown. I had not prepared for this in any way, shape, or form. And I was, being called on to do this at the very last minute. In the end, I got to the location where I was giving this speech. I walked onto the stage. It was so last minute that there's actually a video of this presentation that's still live on YouTube. And if you watch this video, you will see my face, and the title caption on the bottom actually still has my boss's name. So they didn't even have a chance to advise whoever was editing this video that a different speaker was going to be present to give the address. So that gives you a sense of how little time there was. Add on to that the fact that, as there always will be, there were technical glitches. So I was on a stage with a giant screen behind me and a monitor in front of me where I was supposed to be able to see the slides that I was going to be presenting. Monitor in front of me did not work. So I'm in front of a stage in front of 500 business owners giving this presentation that I wasn't prepared to actually give, not being able to actually see the slides that everyone else can see behind me. How did it go? Honestly, not that bad. And why? Because I'm the one who actually built that presentation and I'm the one who knew this material inside and out. And so I was actually able to make my way through this presentation doing a relatively decent job, all things considered. I can look back on this video now, and even if I can still find things that I would improve and that I would do differently, frankly, when I watched that video after the fact, I was impressed with the fact I was able to do as well as I did. And the only reason I was able to do that was because I knew this material like the back of my hand. If this was someone else's presentation that I had just been handed 12 hours before I had to give a keynote address, it never would have worked out. It would have been a complete disaster. But because I knew this stuff, I was able to get through it. The next tip for you is also going to be going counter to some traditional public speaking advice. Because oftentimes when you are getting tips on how to speak better in public, one of the first things that you'll be told is you need to get rid of all of those filler words, the ums, the ahs, the likes, those pauses that we inject into our speech when our brain is still processing what to say next. And while if you have too many of those in your speech pattern, it is going to be distracting to your audience, I would say that is nowhere near as important as it is for you to start to find a way to speak in a way that's confident. I would much rather listen to a speaker who sounds confident but still has a few filler words in there than to speak to a speaker who has somehow managed to eliminate every single filler word from their dialogue but sounds monotonous and boring. Because the reality is, when I meet someone on the street and I have a conversation with them, I am going to pause occasionally. I'm going to search for my words. We're used to this, right? So unless you are in a place where the filler words are so rampant that they become a giant distraction, or if there's one specific word that you keep using over and over and over again, I wouldn't worry about that nearly as much as I would about finding a way to ramp up your confidence and increase the amount of engagement that you can get from your audience, because I'd much rather listen to an engaging speaker than a boring one. Here's another tip which can almost act like a hack. A lot of us, when we're speaking, have a certain amount of nervous energy, and that manifests itself in different ways. So you might have a nervous habit where you tap your foot, or where you do something with your hands, or where you have some other kind of twitch. What you want to do, if that is the case for you, is you want to find a way to channel that excess motion, that excess energy into movement. So I, for example, have to pace when I am thinking or when I'm talking, to the point where it became a running gag in many of the places that I worked, that even if I had a closed door office, if I was on the phone with someone, I would have a headset on and I would pace up and down the hallways. And so that actually drove a lot of people nuts. I don't recommend it, but I have a lot of nervous energy like that. So what do you do with that when you are speaking and when you are delivering a speech or speaking in front of a crowd? Well, you find a way to take that nervous energy and channel it into movement that is going to be engaging. That could either be talking with your hands, or it could be deliberately walking up and down the stage. Anything that is going to channel that movement so that you're expending some of that energy, but isn't doing it in a way that's distracting and feels more engaging to the audience, that's going to be something that's helpful. Because a lot of times you'll get tips like, oh, do something with your hands to better engage the audience, use your body language, do something, show some movement so that you're not a straight up board standing behind a lectern, because that's just boring. At the same time, you'll also get advice like, oh, don't fidget, don't do this, don't do that. So what you can do is you just take that nervous energy and you funnel it into the movement that you want to create. And that is a way for you to be more engaging, but still, release some of that nervous energy that is going to happen no matter what. Next up, when you speak in public, I want you to make sure that you use notes correctly. There's this absolutely great story about Winston Churchill, who's probably one of the greatest speakers of the last century. And Churchill was notorious for giving really eloquent speeches in Parliament in the UK. Even before he was elected Prime Minister, this was just kind of what he was known for. But there was a point relatively early in his career where, even though he'd already made his name as a great speaker, he got up to deliver his speech and his mind just went blank. And he couldn't remember what he was going to say. He was terribly embarrassed. And from that day forward, Churchill always showed up to every single parliamentary speech with note cards with his entire speech written on them. For all intents and purposes, he never once looked at those note cards, but it gave him a measure of safety and security to have them with him. The thing that I want you to take from this story is not that you should have a verbatim copy of your speech with you, because if anything, I actually don't suggest that in any way, shape, or form, because if you have that, the temptation is going to be for you to read your speech. And there is nothing more boring than listening to someone read a speech to you. I've always said that if you're just going to read me a speech, just give me the speech and I'll read it myself. It'll be faster, I'll get more out of it, and it'll save you the trouble of looking nervous up there. So don't bring a verbatim copy of your speech into any presentation. However, having notes that you can use as sort of a crutch or a security blanket, that is something that is completely okay. The way that you do this, in my mind, is you don't bring a full copy of your speech, but rather cue cards where you have individual words that can jog your memory if you were to get lost. That is what you should be aiming for, but you should also be preparing to yourself to the level that you shouldn't actually need those index cards or those cue cards. You should really do this in such a way that you feel confident enough to do it without them, and they're really only there as a last-ditch effort. As a parenthesis here, the other thing that I would say never, ever, ever do, don't put your notes on your phone. People who read their notes off of their phone just look like they have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know if it's because of the small size of the screen, but you lose your audience when you're reading notes off of your phone, so just don't do that. The next two tips are related to eye contact. So you know that when you make eye contact with someone, it's going to be much more easy for you to create a connection with them, to engage with them, for them to feel like they are being drawn into what you're saying. So you want to find ways to make eye contact with an audience. But if you're a nervous speaker, making eye contact with someone while giving a speech could be enough to make you lock up, to make you freeze. And so you need to find a way to make eye contact without freezing. One of the ways you can do this is to look for a friendly face in the audience. Anytime I'm giving any kind of presentation, I try and make sure that I find at least one person in the audience who is either someone who I know I can count on to be that friendly face, or just someone in the audience who looks like they are genuinely interested in what you have to say, who's smiling, who looks pleasant. Even if they don't actually care what you have to say, that doesn't matter. What's important is that when you see that person, you feel reassured because they look engaged. Whereas if you spend time trying to make eye contact with people who look bored, that's going to hurt your confidence. So you want to find someone who looks engaged, who looks appealing. You don't want to spend all of your time looking at that person, but you want to kind of use them as an anchor so that as you're scanning the crowd, when you feel like you need a little bit of a boost, you can come back to that person, they increase your confidence, and you can keep going. The other tip I have related to eye contact is that when you're speaking in front of a crowd, you know eye contact is important, but the reality is you don't actually need to make eye contact for it to look like you're making eye contact. When I'm speaking to a large crowd, I can be looking over the top of their heads and no one would actually notice that I'm doing that, right? Just like I'm talking to you into this camera right now, I'm not looking into your eyes, but it feels like I'm looking into your eyes because of the way the lens is. And when you're in front of a large crowd, it's the same idea. If you're talking to someone face to face and you try and look over their head, it's going to be weird, it's going to be awkward. But the advantage of speaking to a crowd is you are far enough away that with that distance, you don't actually need to lock eyes with someone and get into that awkward situation where you feel like they're staring deep into your soul. So just looking at the top of someone's hairline, for example, that's probably good enough for people to feel like you're engaging them in the conversation. My next tip for you when you are giving a presentation is that unlike when you're writing, in writing, you want to make sure that you are using your words efficiently, effectively, that you remove all redundancy. When you're speaking, it's a different ballgame. You don't have the advantage of a paper structure, of headings, of someone being able to flip the page and go back. And so when you're speaking, you actually do want to repeat yourself occasionally. When you repeat yourself, you give the audience a chance to kind of come back to what you were saying before if they missed it, or even if they didn't miss it, it allows you to re-emphasize a certain point. So remember that speaking and writing are not the same. And oftentimes the best writers are often going to be good speakers because it helps them to organize their thoughts and so they can create an organized speech. But there is a level of differentiation that you need to make in order to understand that you can't just take the same structure you would use in a really well-written memo or essay, for example, and then just take that and give it as a presentation, because you have lost the benefit of all of the anchoring and all of the architecture that you have around those words. And so repetition, not a bad thing when you're giving a presentation. That being said, you don't want to repeat the exact same words over and over and over again, because then you're just going to bore your audience. But, saying something, introducing a topic, telling someone what you're going to say, saying it, and then telling someone what you just said, that is a very normal approach to delivering a presentation, and it is not something that should be shied away from. On the contrary, it's something that you should probably try and replicate. The next tip I have here is that you need to remember when you're giving a speech, when you're talking in front of a crowd, that part of what you're doing is you are entertaining. So if you watch any of the best speakers, whether they are politicians or people that you watch on the internet or, TED Talks or whatever, a lot of the times the thing that the best speakers have in common is that it's not just the content of what they're saying, but it's the way that they're delivering it. And the way that they're delivering it is in some way, shape, or form entertaining. I had a boss earlier in my career who, when we had this all hands meeting, we flew everyone from the company in from all corners of the globe, and he was just coming into this company and no one really knew much about him. So there was a little bit of nerves and, kind of expectations, what's going to happen, as often happens when you get this type of person. And he got up on this stage in front of, I want to say something like 600 employees. And he started off by telling the story of how he got to work that morning. And so he had to come from, first of all, he wasn't from the city, so he had to come from his house. He took an Uber to the airport. And so he's telling the story of how he arrived to that stage. But as he was telling the story, he had the audience in stitches. He was funny. He was hilarious. He was engaging. And what that did was it allowed a lot of that tension to kind of evaporate from the room. And once the tension was gone from the room, then he could get into the more serious topics that he wanted to address. And he had an audience that was much more receptive to what he had to say. By the way, I spoke to that same person after he delivered his speech, complimented him on how well he did. And I asked him, how did you prepare for this? What did you do? And as it turns out, one of his hobbies was he liked to practice stand-up comedy, and he was part of an improv troupe. So if you've ever heard the tip that if you want to get better at speaking in public and do some improv, I can vouch with firsthand experience that it works. Related to the previous point, Another tip for you is, especially if you're going to be entertaining, you need to make sure you know your audience. What I mean by that is if you are going to try and make people laugh, you need to understand the type of humor that's going to work for them. Really concrete example here, I was watching a TED Talk by an individual who was, I don't want to name names here, so let me just say they were reputed to be one of the best speakers in their profession. And I listened to this TED Talk, and as they were giving this speech, I said to myself, this guy's good, but he's not great. Some of his delivery felt awkward. His jokes felt forced. The audience really wasn't connecting with him. And so after I watched this TED Talk, I tried to kind of analyze and figure out what went wrong. And the conclusion I came to was this speaker was used to giving presentations to an audience that was much younger, at a very different stage in their life. And so the types of humor that he used was more directed to a younger audience, and he didn't adapt that humor to a TED audience, which is generally speaking going to be a little bit older, in a very different place in their life, have different sort of interests. And so when you take the same jokes that work well in a situation where you got a group of young people and you try and present it to a group of older people, those jokes are just going to fall flat and it's not going to work. And as a result, you go from being a, what would otherwise be a 10 on 10 speaker to maybe a mediocre 7 on 10 speaker. So make sure you understand your audience if you are going to try and be humorous or if you're going to try and relate to them on any level. Next up, when you're delivering a speech, you want to make sure you are using 10% more energy than you think you need to be using. And the reason for this is that when you give a speech, you are probably in your own head. And so even if it feels like you are being really energetic and being really charismatic, the reality is a lot of that energy is just nervousness, and that is not being conveyed to the audience. And so if you want to make sure that you're giving off enough energy to your audience, you need to be over the top in terms of energy. And when you go back and you look at how that speech was received, you'll be surprised by the fact that what you said and felt like was way too over the top when you were delivering it actually comes off as being probably just right when you're in the shoes of the audience. Related to the previous point, as you're delivering your words, you want to make sure you're speaking about 10% slower than you think you should be speaking, because again, when you're up there and when you're nervous, you have a tendency to speak a lot quicker because of your accelerated heart rate. And so what feels to you like a normal rate of speech oftentimes will be far too quick for your audience. So speak a little bit slower than you think you need to speak, and that's probably going to be a good speed for what your audience actually wants to hear. Almost at the end now. Whenever you are in a situation where you can tell a story, make sure you use stories to your advantage. The reality is that people respond to stories. That's how we communicate. It's how we've communicated since the beginning of our species. It's through stories. It engages people who are listening to each other. If your entire presentation is just a series of fact after fact after fact, no one's going to want to pay attention to you. No one cares. They're going to lose the thread. They're going to be disinterested. They're going to be checking their email within the first 5 minutes. But a story has the natural ability to pull someone in because they want to know what happens next. So anytime you can frame your presentation as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, with a challenge that needs to be overcome, with a protagonist that needs to win the day, these are all things that you can do to make your speech more engaging. And bonus tips if you can make that protagonist the audience itself. And the last tip I have for you about how to speak better in public is to make sure you're practicing intentionally. Now, it is no secret that the only real way to get better at speaking is to practice a lot. And there's really no way around this. Even if you apply every single tip in this video, unless you're actually practicing, you're never actually going to get better. The only reason I became a moderately decent speaker was because throughout my career, I had to deliver hundreds upon hundreds of presentations. And so over time, you naturally will get better. But the only way that happens is if that practice is intentional. What do I mean by intentional? It's not enough just to practice over and over and over again. You actually need to think about what you're doing and focus on those things you're getting better at. So in order to do that, you can't just take a presentation that you're about to deliver, rehearse it in your head 10 times, and then expect that you're going to do a good job when you actually go in front of the audience to deliver it. No, you actually have to say that presentation out loud. You need to make sure you are standing in front of a mirror so that you can see what you're doing, so that you can take cues from yourself. If you can't stare at yourself in a mirror while you're giving a presentation, How are you going to stare at 50 strangers? So make sure that whatever you're doing, there is some form of deliberate expressive practice. Even better than delivering a speech into a mirror is record yourself, because then you have the added benefit of being able to go back over your presentation after the fact, watch it with a critical eye, identify those things you need to get better at, and then when you redo it the next time, you could say, okay, now this time I'm going to do it again, but now I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to speak slower, or I'm going to add in more hand gestures, or I'm going to cut out these filler words, or I'm going to change the way I presented this story. All of this stuff is intentional practice, and it's the only way you actually get better at doing something. So it's not good enough just to repeat something to yourself over and over and over again in a dark room. You need to do it in such a way that you can identify the things that need to be made better and then do it after the fact. Another really, really great way to do this is to force yourself to get feedback by taking your presentations and putting them in a place where other people can see them. So for example, start a YouTube channel. You don't need to start a YouTube channel because you want to become internet famous. It is just really good practice of a way to get better at speaking in public. So there's a tip for you. One of the side effects of being able to speak in public is that this skill translates into all sorts of other areas of your personal and professional life. You get better at interacting with people on a one-on-one basis, in personal conversations, or in a job interview, for example. But if you are interested in getting to a job interview, then before you get to that stage, you probably need to make sure you have a good resume. If you want to make sure your resume is up to stuff, then watch this video and make sure you subscribe to the channel for other tips and lessons about things you probably should have learned in school but didn't.